All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. Owen Richardson from the Department of Geosciences at CSU Fort Collins will be presenting the results of his study over the last couple of years. He's been to the Southern Plains Land Trust Preserves to do a study for us. Um, Let me do a quick intro on Southern Plains Land Trust for those who are not familiar with our organization. Um, we are Southern Plains Land Trust. It's our mission to protect a. I've got Henry in the back here. It's our mission to protect a network of prairie refuges for prairie native wildlife. We currently own and manage over 60,000 acres in southeastern Colorado. And one of the ways we ensure that our preserves are an actual refuge for native wildlife is because we actually restore the habitat after decades of overgrazing. Um, Overgrazing by cattle causes soil compaction, homogeneous vegetation patterns, sometimes desertification, and stream bank erosion. And this is a big problem. Usually, once we purchase a preserve, we kind of look at the status of the streams. And one thing we first do to stop overgrazing is remove the cattle from the landscape to relieve that kind of pressure. Second thing we do is we restore streams. And that's what Owen has been studying. A couple of examples of how we restore streams closer to the Arkansas River, for example, where our streams have water almost year round. We replant native vegetation, for example, willows and cottonwoods. A little bit farther upstream, we've been working on building beaver dam analogs and log jams and pushing in woody debris or like dead wood into the stream to give that extra structure. And even closer to the headwaters on our preserves, we've been working on stream erosion issues by building one rock dams. And a one rock dam is called a one rock dam because it's the height of one rock. So it's basically a tiny little barrier that won't stop flowing water, but that will slow down flowing water, kind of building back that soil level by capturing sediment that's flowing down from the hill. Um, One rock dams are called low-tech process-based restoration structures because you don't need heavy machinery to build it. You don't need complex engineering. And you can use the power of the flowing water as it comes down the hill to kind of fill up those erosion pits that are created, have been created by overgrazing. But when you're standing there in the field, and Southern Plains Land Trust has over 100 of these structures on the preserve built by volunteers, when you're standing there in the landscape, sometimes it still is really confusing to think like, okay, where am I actually going to build this one rock dam? How can I know if this is really going to be efficient in solving that erosion problem? So that's that question we kind of released onto Owen to solve that issue, solve that problem. How can we know if our stream restoration activities have been effective? And Owen has promised that we'll do a Q&A at the end of his presentation. So feel free to write down your questions or keep them in your head till Owen is done. And once, like after Owen has presented, you type your question in the chat or raise your hand with the raise your hand feature, but please keep yourself muted during his presentation. So Owen, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Judith. That helped provide a lot of background information. I'll try not to repeat too much of it. Um, just before I get going, I kind of want to talk about my biases in this. I am looking at streams through the lens of a fluvial geomorphologist, which means I am a physical scientist who studies rivers. Um, I know a lot of folks here might have backgrounds as ecologists or in ecology. I am not a life scientist. And so that's maybe an important thing to keep in mind in the way that I think about some of these processes. I'm maybe not as focused on habitat, but more the physics. So hopefully the physics informs where the habitat is improved, but general bias as to how I think about streams. All right, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the history of river restoration and its application to grassland streams. Stream restoration is a multi-billion-dollar global industry annually, and the specific river restoration techniques and river engineering techniques have come in and out of fashion through time. But recently, process-based restoration has become a very widely implemented river restoration philosophy that emphasizes restoring underlying physical processes rather than just treating symptoms or prescribing desired landforms. So process-based restoration is what the Southern Plains Land Trust is aiming to accomplish. Low-tech process-based restoration builds on this, but further emphasizes using simple hand-built interventions with natural materials. So exactly like Judith was talking about, volunteers can come out and build these things. A lot of the materials are locally sourced from old buildings and fence lines. So it's really great for an environment like the Southern Plains Land Trust. And practitioners have taken this approach. The consulting world in particular has taken this approach and ran with it. These are just a few examples of low-tech process-based restoration design manuals that aim to convince land managers to use a variety of different hand-built structures to address erosion and other perceived problems in degraded streams. Low-tech process-based restoration is being applied very broadly. It actually outpaces the science. We don't have a great understanding of what these actually do to streams, and this is especially true for grassland streams. There's really a dearth of literature on river restoration in grassland systems. Before I talk about restoration, I think it's important to talk about the processes in grassland streams because we're trying to restore the processes. And the way that I think about grassland streams is by splitting it into these two process domains, mostly defined based on the flow regime. And what I mean by that is there's two regimes. The first is way up in the watershed in the headwaters. Flow is ephemeral or discontinuous through time. And then the second process domain consists of incised, intermittent, and perennial channels, meaning that flow is continuous through time, but maybe discontinuous through space. And these perennial channels are very deeply incised, meaning they're very deep. They're often called arroyos or washes, and flow in arroyos doesn't readily access adjacent surfaces. There's not a traditional floodplain in a lot of these systems. Something important I want to point out is that geologic studies have shown that arroyo erosion and aggradation is actually a natural process. It's been happening for thousands of years in response to small changes in climate and actually the crossing of internal thresholds to do with slope and the forces it generates. So erosion in these systems is not necessarily bad, and it's also not necessarily caused by humans, although there is very strong evidence that grazing and other land use, including the building of roads, can increase erosion of arroyos. I'm realizing this might be blocked. Sorry. Okay. Within the ephemeral headwaters, there is a really important process that is actually a little confusing that forms these channels, and it's called soil piping or piping collapse. This is sort of similar to the process that forms traditional sinkholes that happen maybe in the southeastern United States where there's a lot of limestone, but this happens in soils. And the way that soil piping works is that infiltrating water encounters a restrictive layer at depth, and then perched saturation builds up on top of this layer, filling up the pore spaces in that soil, eventually driving lateral flow down gradient or downhill. If this flow happens at a steep enough gradient, it can begin eroding out earthen pipes, sometimes reaching a meter in diameter. These pipes then collapse in on themselves, leaving behind a sinkhole or a head cut with a really distinct amphitheater shape. You can see that shape in both my field photo and the conceptual model. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is a map of some of the Southern Plains Land Trust's preserves. The larger cluster on the right is Heartland Ranch Preserve, and on the left, the one labeled G, is the Raven's Nest Preserve. All of this was commercially grazed very heavily by cattle prior to acquisition by the trust. And the specific land use history is actually pretty complicated, and the acquisition history happened in a very piecemeal fashion. So to simplify it, I've kind of broken that up into two phases. The first occurred over 2013 to 2015. The land trust acquired parcels A, B, and G, and took the cows off. And then the second phase happened over the 2020s, parcels C, D, E, and F, and the cows off sometime 2021 on. So parcels A, B, and G in blue had historic grazing, but have since rested for about a decade. The others have had more recent grazing. That's kind of how I'm categorizing it. Just to give a sense of scale of the grazing, talking with Jay, who has been with the land trust for quite a long time, he gave a ballpark number of there were about 2,000 head of cattle that would graze Heartland Ranch, that right cluster, as one continuous pasture every summer. That is quite a lot of cows. And then, like Judith mentioned, there are a lot of stream restoration structures throughout the land trust. Many of these look like the ones that I showed in those manuals towards the start of the talk. Some of them are erosion control structures shown in yellow on the map, and then others are beaver dam analogs shown here in purple. And this actually presents a really unique opportunity to not only think about the performance of the structures, but the recovery of the landscape as a whole, and maybe how the landscape scale recovery is impacting the performance of the structures. So as a part of my research, I asked two central questions. The first being, how do landscape scale characteristics, namely soil compaction and vegetation cover, recover following the end of large-scale cattle grazing? The second question is, how do these characteristics, along with basin and site scale hydraulic conditions, influence the transect scale geomorphic response of in-channel restoration structures? I'm going to start by talking about the landscape scale recovery. And the first property that I was interested in measuring across the landscape was soil compaction, like Judith mentioned. Intense cattle grazing can compact the soil, just the cows manually trample it with their hooves. Compacted soils have decreased infiltration rates, which means that more water will run off over the surface and erode soil, introducing large loads of sediment into the streams. But if the cows come off, maybe there is opportunity for the soil to recover and decompact through bioturbation, insects, microbes, larger biota like prairie dogs and tarantulas, reworking the soil, helping build aggregates and whatnot. The way that I measured soil compaction was with bulk density, which is defined as the dry soil weight divided by the total volume of a sample. So I went out all across the Heartland Ranch Preserve and dug a bunch of holes. I used that little metal cylinder there to sample bulk density. I drove it into the soil surface, extracted the sample, trimmed off any excess, then brought it back to the lab, dried it, and weighed it, divided by the volume of the cylinder. So that's how I got the bulk density, the soil compaction. I sampled across 6 of those parcels with different grazing histories, and then within each parcel across 4 different soil texture categories. I took 10 samples for each parcel texture combination for a total of about 240 soil samples. And what I found pretty convincingly is that the soil is less compacted in long rested areas. What we're looking at here are some box and whisker plots on the y-axis showing the distribution of bulk density values across different sites. The site numbers are shown on the x-axis. And the important thing here is that these 2 parcels, which had historic grazing but have since recovered for about a decade, have noticeably lower bulk density distributions, indicating that the soil has decompacted and recovered remarkably quickly. I did some more complicated statistics and showed that this trend was actually observed within each soil texture class. It didn't matter how sandy, silty, or clayey it was. Very consistently, the parcels that had rested had soils that recovered. They decompacted. The second property I was interested in measuring across the landscape was vegetation cover. The thought here being that through their consumptive grazing, cattle can damage vegetation communities, sometimes leaving behind very large bare patches, sort of that desertification process Judith mentioned. And the way that I got at this was by using remote sensing with satellite imagery. I used the Bare Soil Index, which basically works by just taking advantage of differences in the spectral reflectance profiles for bare soil versus vegetation. I used Landsat imagery, if anyone's familiar with that. It's a US government satellite. And I used it to balance essentially the length of record. It goes back quite a ways with the spatial and spectral resolution of the satellite imagery. I generated composite images, so one image sort of averaged across the entire summer for each year from 2013 to 2025. This is an example of the composite growing season image for 2024. And I don't have like extensive ground truth data. I would encourage a future researcher to maybe do more field studies, maybe an ecologist. But it seems to do a pretty good job as a first pass. This image here is pointing to the headwaters of some of the streams, and there are some small ephemeral wetlands. It's very wet up there, and these areas are surrounded by dense grass communities, and they plot in that green color, indicating that they are pretty densely vegetated. Farther downstream, there are areas of perennial flow surrounded by dense cattails and other sedges, again plotting as very green, low bare soil index, indicating very vegetated conditions. This is in contrast with the western edge of the preserve, which I noticed in the field had quite a few of these bare patches, and that's plotting more in that tan color, indicating more bare conditions. So does an okay job at understanding the land cover. I went ahead and extracted the median bare soil index value for each year and each land use history parcel and made a multiple linear regression model to ask the question, does the temporal trajectory of surface bareness differ among grazing histories after controlling for precipitation? And really, this is just recognizing, okay, we know that the vegetation is going to be really variable through time in response to precipitation. You know, we're out in the plains, it's very dynamic. But is there any difference in the trajectory through time of the vegetation signal when thinking about the parcels that have rested for a long time versus those that had continuous grazing into the 2020s? Is there any recovery signal? And Unfortunately, it turns out no. There was not a statistically significant difference among grazing histories. And what this is telling us is actually that the precipitation signal totally dominated everything. The vegetation was really just very responsive to the precipitation, indicating that we're seeing the vegetation signal is indicating the popping up of annual plants rather than the long-term recovery of perennial grasses. And well, this might be a little disappointing. It's actually fitting in with a growing body of literature that indicates that um, that progressive grazing management strategies like rotational grazing and grazing exclosure actually don't result in any difference in remotely sensed upland vegetation cover. And I'm careful to say upland because it's actually in contrast with the riparian area near rivers, which is very responsive to those types of grazing strategies. Uplands, though, the vegetation is a little bit more stubborn. I expect it to recover on timescales longer than the 10 years that I was able to observe. Notably, the remote methods I used here don't necessarily capture changes in root biomass, basal cover, or species composition. All of these, like Judith mentioned, are very important metrics of recovery. I just can't really see them from space. So future field studies could investigate this a little closer. All right, so thinking about the landscape scale, there's really two key takeaways. The first is that the soil compaction has recovered. It is decompacted very quickly after just about a decade, whereas the vegetation cover seems to be taking a bit longer to recover. So there's this question of timescales of recovery, and it's not the same. All right, moving on to the transect scale project monitoring side of the project. Again, this is asking how do landscape scale recovery along with basin and site scale hydraulic conditions influence the transect scale geomorphic response of in-channel restoration structures. The way that I did this was I went out across the preserve and I surveyed all of these structures. I first recorded whether or not they were intact, and then among the intact ones, whether or not they resulted in any geomorphic change. And the most common geomorphic change I saw was the deposition of fine sediment within or behind the structures. You can see some fine sediment deposited in panel C here in the spaces in this one rock dam. That's in contrast within panel B. There is no fine sediment there, meaning that the structure, it's been sitting there, the vegetation's been growing through it, but it hasn't clearly resulted in any change in the stream's form. I identified 92 unique clusters of structures, so I grouped them if they were in the same area addressing the same erosional problem. Like Judith mentioned, there are well over 100 individual structures. Many of them were one rock dams, like all of these ones. Quite a few more were post-assisted log structures aiming to mimic natural wood in streams. An example of an effective one, again, in panel C, you can see some fine sediment that has piled up behind that structure. One particularly ineffective structure that I want to point out just again because it's kind of a weird process, these piping collapse sinkholes, is this log step fall structure. In some of those consulting guidebooks, you can find manuals that say to do exactly this. But if you remember when I introduced this process earlier, the erosion is actually driven from the subsurface. So these logs here are actually just sort of covering up the structure. They're not necessarily stopping the sinkhole from forming and developing further. All right, so I compiled all of my results and made a logistic regression model to ask basically what sorts of geomorphic and hydraulic variables might control the odds that a structure is or is not intact. And it turns out drainage area was a really important predictor, basically where we are in the watershed. Just to orient you, down in those values closer to 0 on the x-axis, that's way up in the headwaters, and there were plenty of structures right there, right at the drainage divide. And then farther downstream, structures were placed in increasingly large channels with large contributing areas up to 82 square kilometers. There's actually one that was a giant channel with like 1,000 square kilometers contributing area, but it was destroyed before I could find it, so I couldn't. I don't know where it went. um, and yeah, we can see a really convincing exponentially decreasing trend here. It turns out that each additional square kilometer of drainage area is associated with, on average, 6.6% lower odds of intactness. And that actually makes some sense if we think about the flow regime up in the headwaters. There's very little surface flow in the channels, so the structures remain intact. Farther downstream, those channels are subject to very large flash floods, incorporating flow from many different tributaries. These floods can exert a lot of force on the structures, ultimately destroying them and leading to low odds of intactness. And then among the intact structures, I made a similar logistic regression model to ask what sorts of geomorphic and hydraulic variables might impact the odds that it results in geomorphic change or change of the river form. And again, drainage area was a very important predictor, but this time in the opposite direction. Increasing drainage area led to increasing odds of geomorphic change. And this is really just reflecting the sediment yield. Like I mentioned earlier, in small drainage areas, there's very little surface flow, so there's very little erosion of sediment at the surface, and the structures just aren't really intercepting anything. They're not intercepting sediment and not necessarily recording any geomorphic change. Farther downstream, where there is more surface flow, there's more surface erosion, and the structures are there to intercept those large sediment loads and hopefully, trap the sediments and increase the stability of the channel as it revegetates. You might notice these very large uncertainty bands, and that actually reflects additional controls by slope, bank vegetation, and grazing history. Notably that steeper slopes, barrier banks, and more recent grazing or more compacted soils were more likely to result in increased sediment loads, and the structures were there to intercept them. Interestingly, there is a zone, a range of drainage areas from about 16 to, I forget the number, maybe 45 square kilometers, where the probability of both intactness and geomorphic response was greater than 50%. So this could be a range to target for future erosion control structures. Plotting the outcomes out across the landscape, you can again see a really clear drainage area control. In the headwaters, that cluster of yellow structures in the bottom there, most of the outcomes are plotting as that tan color, indicating they were intact but didn't have a detectable geomorphic response. This is in contrast with the structures placed farther downstream. More of those are destroyed, shown in red, but simultaneously, among the ones that are intact, a lot more of them resulted in detectable geomorphic change. Something I really want to emphasize is that soil piping is an overlooked driver of erosion. Like we just saw in some of those small catchments down in the bottom cluster here, those structures weren't actually really doing that much. And that's because erosion there was dominated by pipe collapse. Piping collapse is a subsurface driven process, so surface structure-based restoration isn't actually that effective. And it turns out that soil piping actually occurs everywhere globally. Silt loam soils are very susceptible to soil piping, and there's a lot of silt um, at the Southern Plains Land Trust. I'm sure some of you are well aware of that. And flow through soil pipes can actually be a very large contributor to storm flow during flash flood events. So they're really hydrologically important, and not that many people know about them. There has been some recent research attention to piping in a land management context, um, notably because, and this is really the reason I'm focusing on the soil pipe so much, is that the collapses are some of the most dramatic erosional features on the landscape. Whether you're coming at things from a restoration perspective, like the Southern Plains Land Trust is, or an agricultural production perspective, or even a geohazards perspective, these pipe collapses can cause landslides. Piping is potentially a nuisance. And so that motivated the final part of this talk, which is sort of an exploration of hydrologic constraints on soil pipe initiation. Again, the way that piping works is that infiltrating water encounters a restrictive layer at depth, like a clay or a shale. Perch saturation fills up the pore spaces in the soil on top of that layer, driving lateral flow down the slope. If this happens at a steep enough gradient or a critical hydraulic gradient, it can begin eroding earthen pipes, which then collapse in on themselves. Um, all right, so the way that I thought about this was by using numerical models. And I'm not going to get into the details of the models here. That's not that fun. But the general modeling approach was to use conditions that would favor very rapid infiltration, including a high initial water content and a very big storm event. I used the wettest 3-day precipitation event on record at a weather station nearby to Heartland Ranch. It rained about 5 inches over the course of 3 days in the summer of 2022. You can see that rainfall time series up top there, rain on the y-axis versus time on the x-axis. And then I'm not going to populate them yet, but those bottom 3 plots eventually will show the water content profiles down through the soil. So the depth of the soil is on the y-axis, and the water content is on the x-axis. The right edge of each of those 3 plots will be near that saturated condition where all the pore spaces in the soil are filled with water, where we would start to get susceptibility to piping erosion. And like I mentioned, these pipes tend to form on top of restrictive layers like clays or shales. What I noticed out at the Land Trust was that a lot of these restrictive layers were at least a meter deep, if not 2 or 3. So we're looking for saturated conditions to get at least that far down for susceptibility to piping erosion. This model is more of a proof of concept than an exact site replication. In my field, there's a lot of talk of like, okay, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I'm hoping this you'll see the light at the end of the tunnel eventually as to why this model is useful. I ended up modeling a silt loam soil, and what we can see here is that looking at the infiltration wetting fronts, they don't make it very far down, even though we've modeled a very heavy storm event. We only get saturated conditions maybe half a meter deep, if that. Definitely not down deep enough to where we would get soil piping. Infiltration through the soil matrix is too slow to drive deep saturation during storms. So what I did was I split the model domain into the soil matrix and then fractures. And what we can see is that the fractures saturate up very quickly. There's saturation at depth, even within the first day, that first pulse of rain in the fractures. And then there's a transfer from the fractures to the matrix. So water infiltrates, through large pores in the soil and then saturates the rest of the soil, which could plausibly feed soil pipes and lead to some of those really dramatic sinkholes. And this actually has some implications for restoration and land management, notably that changes in vertical macro porosity could impact pipe initiation. For example, desiccation cracks have been shown to allow rapid infiltration to depth, and prior work has shown that grazing, heavy grazing, can cause a lot of these cracks to form. So more grazing, maybe more piping erosion. At the same time, changes in burrowing animal population and root populations, also root decay, might also impact how much pipe initiation we get. Similarly, grazing-induced compaction can collapse natural macropores around soil aggregates, again impacting how much rapid infiltration there is. So I am actually not exactly sure in what direction the grazing might cause more of this piping erosion to happen. Certain things about grazing increase piping, certain things about it could actually decrease it. We know for certain, though, that after the cows come off, the soil relaxes, and potentially that initial relaxation and the introduction of more macropores could actually be the reason that we're seeing so many of these piping collapses and that style of erosion. It could be a natural consequence of recovery. All right. Moving on to my conclusions, there's really three key takeaways here. The first having to do with landscape scale recovery. The soil decompacted after about a decade, whereas visible above ground upland vegetation seems to recover on timescales longer than what I was able to observe with my satellite imagery, which is 10 years from when the cows came off to 2025. Structures in piping-dominated headwaters remained intact, but rarely trapped sediment because they don't address subsurface erosional processes, whereas structures in larger catchments were much more likely to be destroyed during peak flows, but simultaneously more likely to initiate local geomorphic change, especially when they were placed in steep, sparsely vegetated, and recently grazed reaches. So when Judith and Henry reached out to basically have my advisor and I cook up this study to assess where the structures were working, where they weren't, my official recommendation would be to target those areas, sort of an intermediate drainage area where the structures are likely to actually get some flow and some sediment, but not too much that they would get destroyed, especially, again, in those steep, sparsely vegetated, recently grazed areas. And then sort of a bonus takeaway to do with that modeling I just showed is that addressing the causes of changes in vertical macroporosity could lead to greater success in understanding what is causing some of those dramatic piping collapses. Some implications. Grassland headwaters are very different than a lot of the streams where restoration techniques are applied very broadly. They're very fine-grained, they're wood poor, and in areas with silty soils, they have a lot of piping collapses. And the structures that those consulting firms push so strongly are actually not that effective here. Whereas the upland restoration has produced very measurable and remarkably fast recovery of the soil. So when we think about manuals like these, I think it's important to give pause and really think about other strategies that can lead to the landscape recovering on its own. Maybe we don't have to build so many of these. Process-based restoration, in my opinion, should continue to prioritize upland approaches. At the same time, I recognize, I just told you, that structures are geomorphically effective when they intercept high sediment loads. So sort of a bonus area that I haven't talked about that the Land Trust can target includes areas just downstream of piping collapses. So the structures won't really help stop the sinkholes, but just downstream of them, flows can transport that already collapsed sediment. But if a structure gets placed there, it can intercept that high sediment load and anchor it, potentially leading to faster revegetation. Something that I haven't talked about as much, because there's really only a sample size of 3, is that the land trust's beaver dam analogs are very effective. Again, there was only 3 of them, but 2 of the 3 remained intact and produced really impressive pools of water and fine sediment deposition. And these are mimicking natural processes. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but there are some beavers in other parts of the land trust, reworking the streams, slowing flow, building their dams, and, helping with the recovery of the streams and the landscape. And I think this is really exciting, and I'm excited to share that a future master's student in my lab will hopefully begin to work with some of these, and also the soil organic carbon side of things. I think maybe the project has changed. I don't know. I would like to thank primarily the Southern Plains Land Trust for supporting me through this research. Um, I think the Land Trust is really remarkable in their approach to restoration, in that they are directly acquiring land, which means they have the opportunity to really take a deeper time, a longer time perspective into restoration, and use an adaptive management strategy, and learn about the landscape and how to restore it. And hopefully, as the years go by and the Land Trust continues on its mission, more and more recovery will be measured. This is unique compared to a lot of the federal lands where restoration is performed, because unfortunately, a lot of those projects have very short timescales and need short deliverables. So the long-term commitment isn't there in the way that the Land Trust has supported. And they also support research, which I think is very cool. I'd also like to thank the Colorado Riparian Association, the Colorado Scientific Society, my advisor, Dr. Ellen Wool, and the CSU Fluvial Geomorphology Lab, as well as the entire Department of Geosciences. I've received some additional help from the Hydrogeology Lab here at CSU as well, with that groundwater modeling that I presented earlier. Thank you, and I would love to take any questions. If you happen to remember any of the slide numbers, that would be helpful. But yeah, I'm hoping we can open this up to a discussion.
Thanks, Owen. That was phenomenal. The good news is we just got a grant to start building 120 beaver dam analogs. So there's going to be lots of work and lots of studying to be done on that. And well, thanks so much, Owen, for sharing your results and the phenomenal work you did. I felt a little pain inside when you showed that image of the intact but no detectable geomorphic response. I was just like, the people, maybe people on this call, but I know so many volunteers have worked so hard, blood, sweat, and tears to build those one rock dams.
Yeah.
Did absolutely nothing. But anyway, a lesson learned.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to say, I do think, I am a recovering scientist, let's say. I think that it shows why we need to do these studies, right? And I think, Owen, I'm just amazed by the body of work you put together. Really impressive work. I do have some questions. Okay. Do you want to? Well, I'll let other people do questions first, but I have a lot of questions. So
okay, I'd like to do. The first question is from Lynn Slater. Did you sample soil density in areas that were never grazed? So you'd have a baseline for comparison, is her question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought about this a lot, and the problem is down there in that corner of the state, pretty much everything has been grazed very significantly. I've recently stumbled across some of these papers that actually do a lot of soil sampling and carbon dating in graveyards because obviously people aren't messing with them. Um, I might be making this up. Is there a graveyard in that Tunerville area over there?
There are two graveyards within the vicinity of Heartland. There's the Bethel Cemetery, I believe, and the Maxey Cemetery. And yeah, I mean that is a really interesting question, Lynn. Yeah. Anyways, that's so interesting that graveyards are like. I mean, I don't think there's anything that has remained like ungrazed by cattle in the American West. It's very rare. So yeah, I mean that's
Yeah,
my understanding of the land use as well. But
yeah. But maybe a future researcher could go dig some holes in graveyards if that's
Yeah,
uh I don't know. That's a little scary.
if that can be approved.
Yeah.
Yes. I think Henry also had a couple of questions.
so we're rewilding, and I think about timescales a lot. And one of the things that was really interesting was the relatively rapid recovery of the soil. It seemed that compression, within a matter of like a decade had relaxed, and that was really interesting. The thing that was a little bit more concerning is that it doesn't seem that had a concomitant impact on vegetation. And my question for you is, do you know of any studies in the literature? I know there might not. It sounds like grasslands are just very poorly studied. So that's another reason why I'm really glad that we're doing this. But do you have any data from grasslands or maybe from other systems where people have been able to track this post grazing and see how long it takes for the vegetation community to recover? And I know that's probably highly precipitation dependent, but I'm just curious to hear your
Mhm.
thoughts.
There's a really good one that some scientists at Trout Unlimited put out. It's not in grasslands, but it's in Nevada, which is a similar like semi-arid climate. They were focused near streams, so that riparian area, and they took the cows off and got a very rapid response. I imagine if I had looked just near streams, I probably would have seen more recovery. The imagery I was able to access for free is like 30 meter by 30 meter pixels, so I couldn't really pick that out. Um, yeah,
Got it.
but
Seems like a
I
long time though, right? It seems like it could be decades or maybe long. I mean, yeah, it's daunting, but I also think that like the key is like you have to change the grazing regime to, it's just, yeah. So
yep, yeah, and yeah. So near the streams, it seems to go pretty fast. Across the landscape takes time, like you said. I don't know how much, but um, restoration is like a long-term commitment.
sure.
Martin, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. Oh, and thanks, first of all, for doing this research. I helped build some of these structures. We knew they were going to fail. We didn't know how many. And I'm really intrigued by the learning about piping. And it makes me think like if at the bottom of an incised channel,
Hmm.
if we dig down at the base, if we go down 6 inches a foot or something like that, would we all of a sudden see a layer of hard clay and shale what do you call it, the low hydraulic conductivity layer?
Yeah, yeah. Often, yes. Not everywhere. So that would sort of be what I call like the local erosional base level. The streams kind of adjust down to that level through time, and it's asynchronous. But quite a few of the streams and some of the samples I took, exactly like you said, if you dig down, you'll find a shale or a clay pretty quickly.
Hmm. Okay.
Especially up in the headwaters where these piping collapses are.
Okay.
I see that Lynn had another question about the vegetation changes above and below the rock structures, uh, and if they were studied before and after the structures were put in place. I know that at Southern Plains Land Trust, we had the tendency to just like go for it, so we didn't study the before as much as the after. But Owen, did you take any data on vegetation changes?
Um, Not so much specifically like above and below, but in the general vicinity of the structure, I recorded sort of just like a categorical variable, how much vegetation there was. It was either like bare, meaning there was less than 10% cover, sparse, which was like less 10 to 50% cover, or dense vegetation at greater than 50%. But yeah, unfortunately, not so much data from the pre-installation.
Yeah.
I was gonna say VOC does take pictures. Like I've got a couple on my phone of what it looked like. Some of those, the before, after, the day we put down the rocks. Nothing organized. Probably be hard to not geolocate it, but there is probably some stuff that could be pulled together.
Yeah. Um, Wait, Martin, are you with VOC?
I am as well. Yes,
Oh, I did the Cairn program growing up. I don't know if how much you know about that, but
definitely very familiar. I'm glad to
that,
hear
that was
heard that.
that was a great time. Yeah, thought I'd just say that.
I see Zach has his hand raised. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I just want to, first off, Owen, nice job, man. You killed it. Learned a lot. I want to continue the thought around vegetation as well,
Hmm.
because we're talking about, your readings were is a bear, and you kind of just you quantified just the amount of vegetation, right?
Hmm.
Essentially.
Yep.
I'm really curious on the amount of piping on mostly native grasses and vegetation compared to some of these invasives, kochia out there, right? Because we know, and there's a lot of studies around this, how far the roots go of these native grasses and how
Hmm.
much more, you called it silt and loam, is going to be secured by those grass roots going down. It's like all the way down to 6 feet or more.
Yep.
Right. So talk about eliminating some of the ability for the piping to even form if more native grasses and vegetation is present. So I'm really curious about comparing, contrasting.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's something I'm super curious about. And I think one of the pathways that can supply the soil pipes is actually the decayed root cavities of dead grasses. So kind of the way I'm thinking about it is maybe the cows come in, and invasive species come in, the root systems of native grasses decay, providing these really deep conduits to depth. Um, but if the native grasses come back, maybe that could help, like you said, sort of anchor some of that soil. I mentioned at the start, I'm not an ecologist, and the species identification is a pretty big weakness of mine. So
No, totally fair.
I
Totally
could
fair.
use some help.
We're on it. We're starting to do more of the work that people have alluded to, pre and post, vegetation sampling. The photos are, the low hanging fruit, but ultimately we're starting to do some of that. So hopefully we'll have some answers. I mean, I do think it'd be really interesting to look at the vegetation composition within some of these areas. And, that last thing is really making me think, because I remember when I first learned about piping and I was like, oh, it's not the cattle. You know what I mean? Like I was wrong. It's all of this erosion is just natural. And I'm not saying it isn't. Obviously, you said it's a global phenomenon, but part of me does wonder if like if long-term overgrazing could potentially synergize to to help, like, so it's like there's a lot of piping occurring, but the reason why is because of the last 200 years of grazing. You know what I mean? Like it'd be interesting to look into that more. It's really hard to test that, obviously, because you'd have to do long-term monitoring of area and know the land use history really well. And
Mhm.
so no, I think it's just making me think a lot. Really, really fascinating. I have another question.
Well, I want to give
Sorry,
give
could I actually? Sorry, I got a thing to say to that, Henry. That's exactly why I pursued that modeling, because I went out there and I was like, there's got to be something that we're doing that's influencing this. There's some way to intervene. The second thing I'll say to that is that there's actually a pretty good study I read out of Belgium, and they found that 97% of the soil pipes they observed, they measured them, I think, with a satellite, were in heavily grazed areas. So we're not the first people to think it might be related to grazing. I think there is something to that.
Got to talk more about this because I'm convinced it is, and I need to find a way to prove it. But anyways, we'll talk more.
Yeah.
Well, in the chat, there have been a couple of comments and questions as well. Candice says one rock dams downstream from the piping collapses aren't totally useless. Yeah, that's kind of what Owen says. Like, they will be useful if they're capturing the collapsing sediment from those pipes, right, Owen? That's what I understand.
Yes, obviously depending on how much rainfall we get, but I think that would be a good spot for them.
And then Lynn has another question: the effects of bison grazing versus those of grazing by cattle.
Yeah, great question. Obviously, a lot of bison at Split. Uh, that's a bit of a can of worms I didn't quite open. Um, but the general thought is that the cows with their large hooves really compact the soil versus the cattle or versus the bison have more pointy hooves that can get down deep and actually sort of promote some of that healthy soil macropore development and provide some turnover. And I don't fully know. That is something I wish I had had more time to dig into. But yeah, maybe you guys have more thoughts on that.
Yes, there are not data available, particularly for the shortgrass prairie, to address this question. It's something that I'm extremely interested in. Most of the long-term bison studies that are available, like from the Kanza, which is in Kansas, which has long-term bison, adjacent bison and cattle graze pastures to look at differences of the impacts of cattle and bison grazing, have found that there are long-term differences. And in particular, if you take a control pasture versus a cattle graze pasture, it's going to be twice as diverse in a cattle graze pasture because grasslands need grazing. But if you look at a cattle graze versus a bison graze pasture, the bison graze pasture will be twice as diverse as the cattle graze pasture because bison just are different. And there's no way around it. Like, people love to say that like they're the same, and like if you manage cattle the right way, like they're the same, but they're really not. And I think that one area this is lacking is exactly that question. We know the impacts on vegetation, but I'm not aware of long-term studies that have looked at the long-term impacts of bison on like soil properties or like, soil like mycorrhizal, communities or like, whatever. So like those are things that we really need data on. And I don't think that we currently have an answer, but I think I know it. We just need the data. Yeah.
Is there anyone with a last question?
Sorry. Oh, and we're gonna have to meet after this because I've got like a billion questions. But
Yeah.
like just thinking as like putting the practitioner hat on, right? Like we found a lot of these structures not effective. It seems like certain areas are more effective. Obviously, like, I mean, would you recommend like not putting structures at all in the upland areas because you didn't see hardly any geomorphic change? It seems like it's just not worth it. Is that accurate?
I think yes. To be completely honest, if we really wanted to put them, just downstream of piping collapses, maybe that's worthwhile. But um, recently I've been thinking a lot about the philosophy behind process-based restoration, and the point is to mimic natural processes, but in these grassland streams, up in the headwaters, there's not large clasts, there's not large rocks, there's not really that much wood even. Further downstream there's wood and there's beaver, and that's great. We should do that. But up in the headwaters, I don't think that those structures are um really addressing the processes. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my most recent
Yeah.
thought on that.
Appreciate it. All right. We'll follow up. I'd like to set up a meeting on because I have a lot more questions, but I'll stop.
I just see Martin hinting. Do you want?
Well, just an idea, like if you're saying that below in these incised channels, if you dig down, there's this solid layer. Is that the first step, digging down into the solid? Like when you build a dam, like you don't build the dam on the surface, you dig down until you get to the bedrock and then you build a dam up. I mean, what if you went down, put like bigger rocks, and that would slow? Does that make sense? So
Uh,
instead of working on the surface, you're working below the dirt surface. Into the to break that layer up between where the perched layer is.
so I don't know for sure. I've seen some studies that look at those sort of subsurface barriers to flow. They've not been that effective in stopping the tunneling, other the piping erosion. Really, I think what people have shown in the past is it's much more about taking the cows off and letting it recover. Um, the yeah, the structure-based approaches, I think, are poorly studied, and it's kind of difficult to attribute any specific outcome to a structure.
Okay. Depressing, but okay.
A reality check. Thanks, Owen, for doing your research. You're always welcome back. Point out where we should be placing structures, what kind of structure, and we hope to continue working with Ellen Wool as well with another student.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to stop the recording, and yeah, thanks, Owen. We'll be in touch. Thanks,
Yes,
everyone.
thank you guys for having me on.
Awesome. Okay, bye everyone. Stop the recording.